It often feels like the news cycle is just this relentless flood, does
Oh, absolutely. Every day, something new, something urgent.
Right. A new headline, a new outrage. It feels like there's always something vying for our attention. But sometimes, beneath that daily torrent, there are these deeper currents at play.
Fundamental shifts.
Exactly. Things that are shaping our world in ways we might not immediately see.
Uh-huh.
So today, we're not just skimming the surface. We're going to take a really deep dive into a stack of stories that, honestly, individually, they're pretty intricate, often unbelievable.
Yeah, jaw-dropping sometimes.
Totally. Yet, when you start weaving them together, they paint this really striking picture of how one administration, the Trump administration, approached power. And in doing so, how it relentlessly tested the very foundations of American institutions.
Precisely. And our focus today is pretty broad. It spans everything from the integrity of our justice system, the bedrock of economic policies, right through to national security.
And even those bureaucratic processes, the ones that are supposed to be impartial.
Exactly. So the mission for this deep dive really is to unpack these specific cases. Cases where the rule of law wasn't just challenged, but sometimes it felt like it was openly defied.
Right.
We'll explore how these long-standing norms were, bent, sometimes maybe to their breaking point, and how those critical lines, the ones between, say, raw political will and genuinely impartial governance, they just became dangerously blurred under this administration.
And this isn't just, abstract legal stuff or political fights happening somewhere else.
No, not at all.
These deep dives, they reveal patterns, right? Patterns of behavior, patterns of governance that directly impact how our country actually functions day to day.
How secure your wallet feels.
Exactly. And the fundamental safety of your rights. So settle in, because what we're about to explore, I think it'll likely make you question what you thought you knew about accountability, and maybe about the true enduring strength or perhaps fragility of our system.
Let's dive in. The weaponization of justice and bureaucracy. Cases of overreach and defiance.
Okay, let's unpack this first story, because it really offers a stark illustration of the themes we're discussing today. We're starting with the story of Abrego Garcia, a man whose personal fight became this powerful symbol of defiance against governmental overreach during the Trump years. This isn't just a legal battle, it feels more like a saga.
It really is. Marked by political deportation, a brutal aftermath, and this desperate fight for justice that landed him right in the crosshairs of a very powerful political machine.
So walk us through it. How did Garcia's ordeal begin?
Well, it's an extraordinary and, frankly, deeply troubling case. It started with an illegal deportation under the Trump administration back in March. And the crucial point here, the absolute key, is that he was removed despite a legal order of non-removal.
So the courts had already said he shouldn't be sent back.
Precisely. This wasn't some bureaucratic mix-up or an error. The government had explicitly recognized, through due process, that sending him back to El Salvador would put him at grave risk. Persecution, abuse, it was all documented.
Okay.
Yet, in direct defiance of these clear court orders, Trump administration officials forced him out anyway.
Just ignored the court.
Seemingly so. And the tragic confirmation, which was utterly predictable, came almost immediately. He was brutally tortured upon arrival in El Salvador. And this isn't just an allegation. It's a fact that was later unequivocally confirmed by multiple courts.
Multiple courts.
Including the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court itself.
Wow. Okay, that's staggering. The Supreme Court ruled on this specific aspect, the torture after deportation.
They affirmed the findings related to the risks and the implications of the illegal removal, yes. And normally, when the Supreme Court speaks, its decisions are binding. They're final.
It's supposed to be, right?
It's supposed to be. But in this case, the Trump administration didn't just disagree with the lower court orders that the Supreme Court ultimately upheld in spirit. They openly defied those court orders multiple times.
How? What did that look like?
Well, they resisted, they delayed. It took immense and sustained legal pressure before they finally brought Garcia back to the U.S.
Okay, so they eventually complied.
They brought him back. But, and this is where it feels almost vindictive, he wasn't brought back as a free man.
Oh.
They returned him only to face fresh charges.
What kind of charges? After everything he'd been through.
Indeed. What followed was what Garcia's lawyers aptly termed a phantom indictment.
Phantom indictment sounds ominous.
It was. He was suddenly facing serious federal charges of human trafficking.
Human trafficking? That's incredibly serious. What was the evidence?
Well, this is where it gets almost unbelievable. The evidence marshaled for this grave accusation was, to put it mildly, laughably thin.
How thin?
It consisted solely of a routine traffic stop from 3 years prior, where he wasn't even issued a ticket.
Wait, a traffic stop where he wasn't ticketed became the basis for a federal human trafficking charge.
That unbelievably became the entire foundation for the indictment. It demonstrated, I think quite clearly, an almost transparent attempt to punish him further for winning in court.
So retaliation.
That's certainly how his lawyers framed it. And Magistrate Judge Holmes, when he reviewed this purported evidence, found it so weak, so unsubstantiated, that he promptly released Garcia from federal detention.
And did the judge comment on the weakness of the case?
He explicitly stated there was no legitimate reason, no credible evidence to hold him.
Okay, so when Garcia's legal team called this vindictive prosecution, what exactly were they pointing to? How does that work legally?
Well, the pattern here was absolutely critical. Vindictive prosecution, legally speaking, usually means the government brings charges or maybe ups the severity of existing charges, specifically in retaliation because a defendant exercised their legal rights.
Like appealing or fighting deportation.
Exactly. In Garcia's case, every single time he fought back in court and won, every time a judge or a court affirmed his rights and ordered the government to act, like bringing him back, the administration seemed to respond by just piling on more legal pressure.
And culminating in this trafficking charge.
Right. Which, again, was based on almost nothing. His lawyers argued it was like a child losing a board game and, in a fit of anger, just flipping the whole table over.
That's quite the analogy.
But it captures the feeling. The lack of real evidence for the new charges, coming directly after his successful appeals, made the retaliatory nature seem undeniable, certainly to his lawyers and apparently to the magistrate judge, too.
And the situation escalated even further after that, didn't it? Before Garcia was released by the judge, the Department of Justice supposedly approached his lawyers with some kind of offer.
Yeah, what they described as a shocking offer. It was presented, reportedly, as a chilling ultimatum.
What was the deal?
The DOJ allegedly proposed this. Garcia could plead guilty to this bogus indictment, the one based on the traffic stop.
Right.
And in exchange, he would be shipped off to Costa Rica, but as a free man.
Plead guilty to a bogus charge to get sent to Costa Rica.
That was the alleged offer. And the explicit threat, if he refused, was, quote, stay in the grinder, implying endless legal battles, continued detention, just grinding him down through the system.
Wow, that doesn't sound like a normal plea bargain.
His legal team certainly didn't see it that way. They framed it as a coercive attempt, a shakedown, really, to strong-arm Garcia into accepting a conviction. Why? Possibly to cover up the administration's own misconduct in illegally deporting him in the first place.
And Garcia and his team, did they take the deal?
No, they courageously refused. They wanted the indictment dismissed entirely. They called it what they saw it as clear prosecutorial abuse.
Good for them. But knowing this pattern, the government's response probably wasn't just to drop it.
You anticipate correctly. The government's response to that refusal was arguably even more outrageous.
What did they do?
They threatened to deport him to Uganda.
Uganda? He's from El Salvador. What possible connection could he have to Uganda?
Absolutely none. He's Salvadoran, zero ties to Uganda whatsoever. And this seemingly random, arbitrary choice of country, it actually exposed a much larger and very unsettling pattern in the Trump administration's approach to immigration enforcement.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What was the why Uganda answer?
Well, the why Uganda question is critical, and it really peels back a layer on a deeply disturbing policy. During the Trump presidency, according to reports and Garcia's lawyers, there was this quiet deal struck with Uganda's longtime authoritarian president, Yoweri Museveni.
A deal involving deportees?
Apparently so. Under this alleged arrangement, Uganda would agree to take deportees from the U.S. people the U.S. wanted to remove, but perhaps couldn't send back to their home countries easily.
Right.
In exchange for various political favors, maybe trade deals, that kind of thing.
So a quid pro quo.
Exactly. For the Trump administration, this served a couple of purposes. First, it allowed them to maintain that tough-on-migration image they cultivated.
Sure.
And second, it provided a convenient, very distant location to send individuals who had, like Garcia, actually won their cases in U.S. courts, effectively banishing them.
Banishing them. Far from their home countries, far from legal help.
Precisely. Making it incredibly difficult for them to pursue further legal recourse or even just return home. Garcia, in this context, was allegedly being treated as little more than a bargaining chip.
A human bargaining chip.
Turning immigration enforcement into something that felt, frankly, indistinguishable from political banishment.
This detail, using people as literal commodities in these kinds of geopolitical arrangements, it really exposes a darker side of how power can operate. So where does Garcia's legal battle stand right now? Is he still facing deportation to Uganda?
Well, presently, Judge Zenas has stepped in significantly. She ordered Garcia to remain in federal custody, at least until an October hearing.
Okay, so that prevents immediate deportation.
Crucially, yes. It prevents any immediate, perhaps retaliatory deportation to Uganda. And now, his lawyers are pursuing an extraordinary, truly unprecedented argument.
What are they arguing now?
They are seeking asylum for Garcia within the United States.
Asylum from the U.S., how does that work?
Their contention is that he has been so persecuted, so abused by the U.S. government itself through this entire ordeal, the illegal deportation, the torture facilitated by that, the bogus charges, the threats, that he actually qualifies for protection from the very government that inflicted this harm.
That's a bold legal strategy. If they succeed, if Garcia gets asylum from the U.S. government based on its own actions against him, what kind of precedent does that set?
It would send an unmistakable, profoundly powerful message, not just to the Department of Justice, but to any future administration.
Which is?
That they cannot abuse your power without consequences. It would definitively establish that you can't just weaponize the legal system, you can't fabricate charges, you can't engage in retaliatory deportations and expect the courts to simply rubber stamp it.
So a major check on executive power.
A huge one. This case, and especially this specific argument for asylum from the U.S. government, would strongly reinforce the principle of due process. It affirms that every single individual, doesn't matter how unpopular or inconvenient they might be to those in power, is entitled to fundamental rights and protection under the law.
And it's telling, isn't it, that basically every court that's looked at Garcia's case so far has ruled in his favor.
It's incredibly telling. Magistrate Judge Holmes, Judge Crenshaw, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, even implicitly the U.S. Supreme Court, by letting lower rulings stand or affirming the risks, they've all consistently ruled that his rights were indeed violated by the Trump administration's actions.
You know, this whole pattern of behavior, it also slots quite neatly into a larger political strategy we saw from the Trump administration, doesn't it? This tendency to cozy up to authoritarian leaders like Museveni in Uganda.
Yeah, there seemed to be a certain admiration for strongmen, didn't there? Leaders who ruled with an iron fist, perhaps seen as models of effective, unconstrained power.
Right. And the way some media outlets, particularly those supportive of Trump, just dismissed Garcia as a joker when he tried to speak out.
Instead of reporting on the deeply disturbing facts of his case.
Exactly. It really underscores how propaganda or just biased reporting can overshadow genuine suffering and these critical challenges to the rule of law. It's a truly sobering case. Now let's shift gears slightly, but stay on this theme of challenging norms within the justice system. Let's talk about another, frankly, bewildering case that challenged the very notion of competence and the proper functioning of high office during the Trump administration. Alina Habba's unlawful tenure as the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey.
Yes, this story is just wild.
It starts with a federal judge's recent ruling that essentially declared, and I'm quoting here loosely, everything she did in that role since July 1st is null and void, gone, invalid, like it never happened.
Yeah, that ruling carries truly profound implications. It created, essentially, a legal earthquake in that district. Alina Habba, who is primarily known, of course, as Donald Trump's personal attorney.
Right, handling his civil cases mostly.
Exactly. She was found by a federal judge not to have been legally serving in one of the most critical federal law enforcement positions in the entire country.
And her background. It wasn't in criminal law, was it?
Not at all. Her professional background prior to this appointment was exclusively in civil law. Zero criminal law experience. To be really clear, she had never led a criminal investigation, never tried major federal cases, never run a U.S. attorney's office.
That seems like a significant gap for that particular job.
Understatement of the year, perhaps. Her track record, which, notably includes the E. Jean Carroll lawsuit, where Trump faced that huge $83 million judgment, and Habba herself was sanctioned by the judge.
Right, I remember that.
That track record has been widely described as, quote, spotty at best, which just further highlights her lack of relevant qualifications for such a demanding, specialized role.
So, okay, someone with essentially zero criminal law experience, a shaky legal track record, and a background screaming civil lawyer. How does that person end up slotted into the role of chief federal law enforcement officer for an entire district?
It's a critical question.
It's not just unusual. It feels like it actively undermines the integrity of that office, right? And by extension, the whole justice system. Remind us, what exactly does a U.S. attorney do? Why is this role so critical?
Yet, it's crucial to understand this isn't some ceremonial post. It is, as you said, the chief federal law enforcement officer for an entire judicial district. They oversee an immense array of responsibilities.
Like what?
Major investigations into things like organized crime, counterterrorism, public corruption, complex financial fraud cases. Think white-collar crime, mob bosses, spies.
The big...
Exactly. The role demands deep knowledge of criminal law, sophisticated courtroom strategy, and an unwavering commitment to prosecutorial ethics. It truly represents, for many, the pinnacle of a career in federal prosecution. It requires years, often decades, of specialized experience. Haba's complete lack of these qualifications wasn't just, a minor issue. It was a glaring problem from the moment her name was floated, raising serious questions about the administration's priorities.
Okay, so if the role is that critical and her qualifications were so clearly lacking, how did this appointment even happen? Aren't there supposed to be checks and balances, constitutional safeguards for appointments like this?
There absolutely are, and that's where this story gets even more interesting. Normally, the president nominates a candidate for U.S. attorney.
Right.
And that nomination requires confirmation by the Senate, the whole advice and consent thing.
Okay, so what happened with Haba?
In this specific instance in New Jersey, both senators, remember, senators have significant influence over nominations in their home state due to her profound lack of criminal experience, explicitly blocked Haba's nomination.
He said no.
Essentially, yes. They signaled they wouldn't support it, which usually stops a nomination in its tracks. So to get around this constitutional process, the Trump administration resorted to what sources described as an end run.
An end run?
They attempted to bypass the Senate entirely by inventing this fancy title, special attorney, to grant her the authority to run the office.
A special attorney? Is that even a real position?
It's a position that simply is not recognized or defined under the relevant federal law governing U.S. attorney appointments. It was arguably made up to circumvent the Senate.
Okay, that's one issue. What about the timing? The judge said invalid from July 1st.
Right. Because even if you try to argue she was an interim appointee, which itself is questionable given the circumstances, there's a strict legal 120-day clock for such interim roles. Once that period expired on July 1st, Alina Haba had no legal authority whatsoever to act in the capacity of U.S. attorneys. Period. Which is why the judge ruled all her subsequent actions, anything she did after that date, were null and void.
Wow. Okay, so beyond the immediate legal invalidation of her actions after July 1st, what are the sort of cascading implications here? For the justice system in New Jersey, for the cases she oversaw, what does this do to public trust?
The fallout is indeed significant and potentially quite messy. Anything Haba authorized during that period of unlawful tenure, any indictments she signed off on, motions her office filed, plea agreements they reached, could now, theoretically, be challenged in court.
So potentially reopening cases? Or having charges dropped?
It creates a legal minefield, absolutely. It could potentially jeopardize ongoing cases and even throw past convictions into question, depending on her level of involvement and the specific action taken. More broadly, though, think about the message it sends. If you let someone sit in one of the most important legal roles without proper authority, you fundamentally undermine the whole system.
Right, it's not just a technicality.
Not at all. It strikes right at the core integrity of the justice system. It erodes public confidence that things are being done correctly, fairly, impartially. And this situation, it also starkly highlights a troubling pattern we saw quite often during the Trump administration, the prioritization of loyalty over competence.
How so in this case?
Well, consider Desiree Grace. She was, by all accounts, a highly qualified, top-ranking career prosecutor within the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office. She was the logical choice, the experienced hand, and in fact, she was the legally appropriate choice, initially appointed by judges for the interim role after the previous U.S. attorney left.
Okay, so she was qualified and in place.
Yes, yet she was reportedly fired from that interim role. Why? Because she was perceived, allegedly, as not loyal to Trump.
Loyalty trumping qualifications again.
It appears so. The bottom line, as the source unequivocally states, seems pretty clear. Alina Haba's appointment was never about justice. It was about loyalty. And loyalty is not, and can never be, a substitute for competence, especially not in a role like U.S. attorney.
It's just a stark reminder, isn't it? When politics aggressively overrides qualifications and legal norms, the justice system itself becomes deeply vulnerable. The fact that the judiciary eventually stepped up and said, no, hold on, this isn't how it works, is maybe a silver lining. It shows the system can push back.
It can, but it's a sign of stress.
Absolutely. It really shouldn't have had to get to that point. Okay, so we've seen how disregarding qualifications created this legal vacuum and undermined the top levels of the justice system with ABBA. Let's now look at how that same intensity, that same kind of political will, was applied to a much more unexpected target, an individual protester.
Ah, the sandwich.
Right. What happens when the full force of federal law enforcement is brought down on something as seemingly trivial as a thrown sandwich? Let's explore the surprising case of the sandwich felony in Washington, D.C.
It's an almost unbelievable incident, really. But it highlights this profound disproportion in how justice was sometimes applied. We're talking about Sean Dunn, who was actually a Department of Justice paralegal at the time.
Working for the DOJ itself.
Yes. He found himself caught up in the middle of the Trump administration's really intense law and order crackdowns happening in Washington, D.C. This was during that period of widespread protests, heavy federal agent presence, very tense atmosphere.
Okay.
And Dunn, apparently fed up with the whole situation, threw a Subway sandwich at a federal officer. Crucially, the officer was in full riot gear.
A sandwich against riot gear. How did that end?
Well, the sandwich, by all accounts, bounced right off. It caused no injuries, a truly negligible physical impact.
Seems pretty minor. Annoying, maybe, but minor.
You'd think so. Yet, despite the minimal nature of the incident, the Trump Department of Justice reacted with extreme force. They went, as the source put it, full nuclear.
Full nuclear over a sandwich. What does that mean?
Charging Dunn with felony assault on a federal officer.
A felony? For a sandwich that bounced off riot gear.
Exactly. It's clear, looking back, the administration sought to make an example of him. They used all this dramatic rhetoric about law and order to send a very strong, very public message.
A message to other protesters. Don't mess with us.
Precisely. Scare people out of protesting. But here's the twist. Here's the part that maybe offers a little bit of hope for the system, that unexpected check on that overreach. The grand jury.
The grand jury. Tell us about their role here.
This is where the story becomes truly significant. And maybe, a small testament to the system's checks and balances when they work. A grand jury, as you know, is made up of everyday citizens.
Right, ordinary people.
Their role is to act as this crucial community check on government power. They decide if there's enough probable cause, enough evidence for criminal charges to actually move forward to a trial.
And prosecutors usually get what they want from grand juries, right? The old saying about indicting a ham sandwich.
That's the notorious reputation. Prosecutors usually have a very easy time getting indictments. They present their side, often without the defense present, and the standard is just probable cause, not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So yes, the saying goes, a prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich.
But not this sandwich.
Apparently not this time. In Dunn's case, the grand jury flat out refused to indict him on the felony charge.
They just said no to federal prosecutors.
They said no. They concluded, with what seems like remarkable common sense, that a Subway sandwich hitting a protective vest does not rise to the level of felony assault.
Wow. That actually is a massive deal, isn't it?
It really is. It signifies that the system, at least in this instance, actually worked the way it was supposed to.
Yeah.
You had ordinary citizens actively rejecting what looked like governmental overreach, rejecting the weaponization of the justice system for political messaging.
And the irony here is just painful, isn't it?
Yeah. It's truly striking. The administration's extreme, almost theatrical reaction to a single, harmless sandwich stood in such sharp contrast to its often, shall we say, softer rhetoric and sometimes lack of decisive action regarding actual gun violence.
Right. One tiny squishy hoagie becomes a federal felony case, while real weapons cause real harm.
And maybe don't always result in the same level of federal outrage or pursuit of felony charges. It highlights a strange set of priorities, to say the least.
So the grand jury's refusal was a big deal, a check on power. But what happened to Dunn himself? Did he face any consequences?
He did, unfortunately. While the felony charge is dead thanks to the grand jury, he faced immediate and severe personal consequences. He lost his job at the Department of Justice almost immediately after the incident itself, before the grand jury even met.
Ouch. So he still paid a price.
A significant price. And technically, there's still a risk that prosecutors could pursue a misdemeanor charge, although the felony is off the table. But the broader message from this incident, I think, is profound. The administration, it seems, wanted to scare people out of protesting.
Right.
But the grand jury's emphatic no was this sort of civic rebellion, a quiet act of local resistance. It highlighted that, democracies still have a pulse, that citizens can still push back.
But there's always that lingering threat of other forms of retaliation, isn't there? Especially when an administration feels defied.
That's a concern legal experts definitely raised in similar contexts. They warned that administrations capable of this kind of initial overreach might still resort to other tactics. Things like, shady IRS audits, maybe targeting family members, or opening seemingly unrelated investigations, ways to make life difficult, making the administration appear openly vindictive, even after a legal defeat in court.
It's good the grand jury stood up, but the potential for vindictiveness is chilling. Still, the idea that everyday citizens actively pushed back against such a clear instance of overreach is genuinely refreshing.
It is. It reminds us that our institutions, when they're allowed to function as intended, can still provide a crucial buffer against politically motivated excess.
Okay, speaking of defiance and governmental overreach, let's now turn our attention south to the Florida Everglades, home to what locals apparently dubbed Alligator Alcatraz.
Yes, quite the nickname.
This was a controversial immigration detention facility that became the center of this prolonged legal storm. And it involved powerful officials, clearly aligned with the Trump administration's immigration policies, openly defying clear judicial orders.
This facility, known aptly as Alligator Alcatraz for its very remote and isolated location deep in the Everglades, was constructed using hundreds of millions in federal funds.
Hundreds of millions, wow.
Yes, a significant investment. And it quickly became a major flashpoint. Federal Judge Williams, on August 21st, issued a really significant demolition order.
Demolition, tear it down.
Exactly, tear it down. She provided a strict 60-day deadline for all operations at the facility to cease and for the structure itself to be torn down.
On what grounds? Why demolish it?
Her ruling was unequivocal. The facility, as constructed, violated environmental law, specifically because there was a complete and utter lack of a proper environmental impact study before construction began.
Which is usually required for big federal projects, right?
Yeah.
Especially in sensitive areas like the Everglades.
Absolutely. It's a critical legal requirement under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, for projects with significant federal funding or oversight. What's truly concerning here, though, is the direct response to Judge Williams's clear order.
What was the response? Did they appeal?
That would be the normal legal route. Instead, Florida's Attorney General at the time, James Utmire, and reportedly the Trump team associated with the project were flat out refusing to comply.
Just refusing, not appealing, just ignoring a federal court order.
Openly defying the order, claiming the facility is properly run, and essentially ignoring the judge's legal finding about the environmental violations and lack of study. This is a direct challenge to the rule of law itself.
Okay, who brought the lawsuit in the first place? Who flagged these environmental issues?
The lawsuit was brought by environmental groups, specifically Friends of the Everglades, and also by the Miccosukee tribe, whose ancestral lands and sacred sites were directly impacted by the construction.
And what specific harms were they alleging?
They detailed a whole litany of specific, tangible harms to the incredibly fragile Everglades ecosystem. Things like concrete poured across wetlands, diesel storage tanks being improperly managed, ongoing sewage issues, propane tanks placed precariously, black and gray water runoff, potentially contaminating the area.
So not just procedural violations, but actual ongoing environmental damage.
Exactly. This wasn't just hypothetical risk. It was concrete, observable environmental degradation, impacting one of America's most vital and sensitive natural resources.
And the federal connection here was clear, because sometimes state officials try to argue federal courts don't have jurisdiction.
Oh, the federal nexus was undeniable, which is why Judge Williams had jurisdiction. The facility operated with immense federal funds. Estimates, as you said, range from $450 million up to maybe $800 million. And crucially, it operated under the direct oversight of ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement, a federal agency. This firmly confirmed that federal environmental laws applied, just as Judge Williams ruled.
Was there other evidence of federal control?
Yes, significantly. Congressman Maxwell Frost, who represents the area, personally toured the facility. He provided a sworn affidavit detailing his observations. Tanker trucks filled with diesel fuel, leaking liquid directly onto the ground, and perhaps most tellingly, an on-site commander openly admitting to him, quote, "ICE controls us."
ICE controls us. Pretty direct.
Very direct. This evidence collectively established both the federal nature of the operation and the extensive environmental violations that, in the judge's view, necessitated the demolition order.
And this wasn't Attorney General Utmeyer's first run-in with this particular judge, was it? There was prior history here.
That's correct. Judge Williams had actually already found Attorney General Utmeyer in contempt of court once before.
Contempt? For what?
For instructing state law enforcement to ignore a different order from her, one that struck down a specific Florida state immigration law she found unconstitutional.
So there's a pattern of defiance.
It certainly looks like a dangerous pattern, as our sources describe it, because fundamentally the rule of law means no one, not an individual, not a state agency, not even an elected attorney general, gets to pick and choose which court orders to obey. That way lies chaos.
And the cost of this facility, you mentioned hundreds of millions. Can we put a finer point on that?
Yes, the figures are quite staggering. It was reported to be at least a $450 million facility built to hold only approximately 250 to 300 individuals.
Okay, doing the math.
If you do the math, that equates to a truly exorbitant cost of at least $1.5 million per person detained there, just for the construction, let alone operation.
$1.5 million per bed. That's astronomical.
It's incredibly high. And this financial mismanagement, or perhaps questionable spending, was further compounded by what appeared to be instances of political favoritism.
How so?
Well, reports suggested that federal taxpayers, through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, were set to reimburse Florida for the facility's construction and ongoing operation costs.
Okay.
Meanwhile, in a striking contrast, Maryland's Democratic governor, during a genuine crisis, was reportedly denied actual flood relief funding from FEMA around the same time.
So funding for a controversial, potentially illegal facility gets approved, while disaster relief for another state gets denied. That looks bad.
It certainly raised eyebrows and fueled accusations of politicized funding decisions under the Trump administration. Adding to the defiance, Utmeyer also launched public attacks, accusing Judge Williams herself of political bias while he was actively under her jurisdiction in this case.
Attacking the judge overseeing your case. Bold move.
It further underscored this pattern of defiance and politicization, seemingly attempting to delegitimize the court's authority rather than engage with the legal merits of her ruling.
So this whole issue, then, it really does go far beyond just one controversial immigration facility in the Everglades, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It fundamentally questions whether the rule of law still holds in this country, especially when challenged by powerful political actors.
Because if elected officials can just ignore judicial rulings they don't like.
It sets an incredibly perilous precedent. It opens the door to potential chaos and the breakdown of order in countless other critical areas. Think voting rights, civil rights, environmental regulations, you name it.
And the specific location matters too, right? The Everglades aren't just any swamp.
Not at all. The Everglades are a uniquely fragile and globally vital ecosystem. They provide essential habitat for endangered species, crucial flood protection for South Florida, and act as a primary source of drinking water for millions of Floridians. Reckless, unstudied construction in such an area poses significant, potentially irreversible long-term risks.
So ultimately, this whole saga, this alligator-Alcatraz fight,
it's truly a test of how strong our legal system really is when powerful people, often aligned with a particular administration's agenda, attempt to simply ignore it. It tests the boundaries of judicial authority and the consequences for defiance. 2, challenging economic and democratic foundations, undermining key institutions.
Okay, we've spent a good amount of time examining how the Trump administration directly challenged the judiciary and various bureaucratic agencies, often through defiance or by questioning competence. Now, let's broaden our lens a bit and explore how similar patterns of defiance and politicization began to erode the very foundations of our economic stability and even our democratic processes.
Right, moving beyond specific legal cases to systemic institutions.
Exactly. And we'll start with a big one. How the Trump administration attempted to undermine the independence of a cornerstone of our economy, the Federal Reserve.
The Fed. Always a target for politicians who want easy money.
Precisely. And this is a story that has a direct, tangible impact on your wallet, your savings, the overall stability of the global economy. It really kicked off publicly when Donald Trump announced he would fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook,
who was notably the first black woman ever to serve as a Fed governor.
Right. A historic appointment. And Trump just publicly said he'd fire her if she didn't resign.
That announcement itself was a clear and very public challenge, really an assault on the Federal Reserve's established crucial independence.
Remind us, legally, can a president just fire a Fed governor they don't like?
No, absolutely not. The law is very specific. A president can only fire a Fed governor for cause.
And for cause means?
It means documented neglect of duty, proven inefficiency, actual misconduct, serious failings in their official capacity. It explicitly cannot be for political disagreement or because the president doesn't like their monetary policy decisions.
Okay, so what was Trump's alleged cause for wanting to fire Governor Cook?
This is where it gets familiar, based on our earlier discussion. His stated cause was based on completely baseless and, by all credible accounts, fabricated accusations of mortgage fraud.
Mortgage fraud? Where did that accusation even come from?
Strikingly, the accusation originated from a criminal referral made by Bill P.
And who is Bill P?
Bill P. was, at the time, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA. He was also a known Trump donor.
Oh. A Trump donor heading a federal agency makes a criminal referral against a Fed governor Trump wants gone.
Exactly. This positioning effectively made Pia look like, as one source put it, Trump's hitman, leveraging a federal agency to create a bogus scandal, providing pretext to remove a perceived political opponent, despite the complete and total absence of any credible evidence that Governor Cook had committed any crime whatsoever.
It really is the same playbook, isn't it? Weaponize a federal agency, generate a baseless accusation, use it as pretext.
It appears to be a recurring tactic, but Governor Cook isn't backing down, is she?
No, she publicly stated she's refusing to leave. Her legal team is fully prepared to fight this, relying heavily on the Fed's unique quasi-independent status.
And that independence is key. It's designed specifically to insulate monetary policy from short-term political pressures.
Right. And this principle, the unique independence of the Fed, it was even reinforced relatively recently by the Supreme Court, wasn't it, in that Trump v. Wilcox case?
Yes, that's a crucial point. The Supreme Court, while dealing with the scope of presidential removal power generally, made a very specific exception, acknowledging the Federal Reserve's unique structure and its need for insulation from precisely this kind of political interference. The law seems quite clearly on her side here.
Okay, so Trump makes this public threat against a Fed governor. How did the markets react? Did anyone notice?
Oh, the market reaction was immediate and stark. It reflected deep concern among investors, both domestically and globally. The dollar weakened immediately after Trump's announcement.
The dollar weakened? Why?
Because global financial markets rely on the perception of stability and predictability in U.S. monetary policy. An attack on the Fed's independence introduces uncertainty, and markets hate uncertainty. It shakes international confidence.
And this isn't just numbers on a screen, right? This has a direct impact on people listening.
Absolutely. It has a direct and highly tangible impact on you, the listener. A weaker dollar means that imports everything from the oil that powers your car, the gas prices you see.
Food, electronics.
Right. The food on your table, electronics, cars you buy, anything coming from overseas costs more. This inevitably leads to inflation.
Which acts like
an invisible tax on every American family budget. It just erodes your purchasing power. The Federal Reserve's independence is absolutely paramount for maintaining stable monetary policy over the long term, insulating it from politicians wanting short-term political gains or trying to time things for electoral cycles. Decisions need to be based on economic fundamentals.
So, why? Why this relentless pursuit of direct control over the Fed? What were the underlying motives behind the Trump administration's desire to subjugate this vital, independent economic institution?
Well, Trump's primary goals seemed pretty clearly articulated over time. It was to pack the Fed with loyalists.
People who would do his bidding.
Individuals who would presumably, unquestioningly, follow his directives. Particularly his desire to cut interest rates.
Why cut interest rates?
To artificially goose the economy, especially before an election. It's an attempt to create a short-term economic sugar high, make the numbers look good for political purposes, regardless of whether it's sound long-term economic policy.
But what's the danger of doing that, especially if inflation is already a concern?
The danger is immense. Cutting interest rates when inflation is already high is, as economists often say, like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Meaning?
It's almost guaranteed to lead to spiraling prices, a further weakened dollar, and significant economic instability. You make borrowing cheaper when you should be making it more expensive to cool things down.
And the irony here is pretty sick, isn't it?
Oh, the irony is profound. Republicans, including Trump himself, fiercely criticized President Biden over inflation levels. Yet Trump's own proposed actions, forcing the Fed to cut rates prematurely, could directly and severely exacerbate that very problem.
It seems to fit into a broader pattern critics pointed to during his administration, this idea of economic self-sabotage.
Yes, that term was used. Policies like the massive tax cuts enacted in 2017, which primarily benefited corporations and the wealthy, and significantly ballooned the national debt.
Right.
The various trade wars initiated, which demonstrably hurt American consumers through tariffs and farmers through retaliatory tariffs.
And cuts to social safety nets.
Exactly. All these policies were often presented as ways to boost prosperity, but critics argued they consistently delivered instability, increased debt, and uncertainty in the long run.
So this fight over the Fed, then, it really does transcend just dollars and cents or interest rates. It questions something much more fundamental about our system.
It fundamentally questions whether the United States still has an independent Federal Reserve. This isn't just about monetary policy. It's about the very structure of our governance and resisting authoritarian tendencies.
And using federal agencies, like we saw with Bill Pai at the FHFA, to generate bogus scandals as pretext to remove political opponents.
That is a characteristic tactic, unfortunately, more associated with authoritarian regimes, not typically with established democracies that respect institutional independence and the rule of law.
But there is maybe some hope here. The courts seem to be pushing back.
It is encouraging, yes. The courts have, in several instances involving Trump's challenges to institutional norms, pushed back against the most extreme cases. This suggests that the law, particularly regarding the Fed's independence, is likely firmly on Governor Cook's side. It suggests the system, while stressed, still possesses the capacity to hold the line against these kinds of politically motivated attacks on crucial institutions.
Okay, let's turn now to another critical area where the Trump administration's economic policies intersected dramatically and perhaps dangerously with national security. We need to talk about the meteoric rise of NVIDIA.
NVIDIA.
Yeah.
The chip giant.
Right. And America's alarming, arguably dangerous dependence on this single company. This story reveals not just market fragility, but quite literally, according to critics, how national security could effectively be put up for sale.
NVIDIA's rise is truly undeniable. It's been astonishing to watch. They transformed from a company primarily known for making graphics cards for gaming.
Yeah, I remember them from that.
Into what is now essentially the backbone of artificial intelligence. Their advanced chips, their GPUs, are now absolutely essential.
Essential for what?
For scientific breakthroughs across numerous fields, for the development of robotics, for self-driving cars, and critically, for advanced military systems, AI-driven defense tech.
So incredibly important technology. And the Trump administration's economic strategy, how did it relate to NVIDIA specifically?
Well, whether it was an explicit strategy or just the outcome of various policies, the effect was that America's financial health became practically tied to NVIDIA's performance.
Tying the whole economy to one tech company.
It certainly looked that way to some analysts, effectively building U.S. market stability, at least in the tech sector, which drives so much of the market, on the fortunes of one single company operating in a notoriously highly volatile industry.
And that creates fragility, right? What happens if NVIDIA stumbles?
Exactly. It creates extreme market fragility. We saw a recent example when NVIDIA slightly missed its earnings expectations. They expected $60 billion, reported $54 billion. Still huge numbers, but less than expected.
Right.
Even a relatively modest 3% dip in its stock price caused the entire market to catch a cold.
Meaning
Broader market indices dropped, impacting the 401ks and pension funds of millions of ordinary Americans who might not even own NVIDIA stock directly, but are invested in market funds. It shows how interconnected and dependent things had become.
So, if NVIDIA sneezes, the whole market gets sick. And this wasn't just the free market at work, was it? Our sources indicate there was active government meddling or influence here under Trump.
Yes, the administration was described by critics as actively propping up NVIDIA in certain ways. This included policies that effectively tied taxpayer dollars, perhaps indirectly through incentives or contracts, to its success, almost like the government acquiring a significant stake, but without giving citizens any actual stock certificates.
And then there were the tariffs. How did they play into this?
Right. The tariffs, the administration slapped these sweeping, sometimes 100% tariffs on competing foreign chips, particularly from China. The stated goal was to force those companies to set up manufacturing here in the U.S.
Did it work?
It had mixed results, but one clear outcome, according to economists, was higher costs for American consumers and fewer options in the market as companies passed tariff costs along or sourced components differently. It arguably benefited NVIDIA by hindering its competitors.
Okay, but The most concerning aspect, the really alarming part, relates directly to national security, doesn't it?
Yes, this is where the story takes a darker turn. U.S. export controls are typically designed, for very good reasons, to prevent the sale of America's most advanced technologies, especially advanced semiconductor chips, like NVIDIA's Blackwell AI chip, to potential adversaries like China.
Why? What's the specific concern with chips?
Because, as security experts consistently recognize, there's often a clear one-to-one relationship between civilian tech in China and military tech. Advanced civilian technology, especially AI chips, inevitably fuels military advancements. They're dual use.
Okay, so we normally restrict sales of the most advanced chips. What happened under Trump?
Well, according to reports cited in our sources, under the Trump administration, a deal was effectively struck. A deal that allowed NVIDIA to go ahead, sell the chips, even the advanced ones, to China.
Sell our most advanced AI chips to a strategic rival. What was the catch? Why would they allow that?
The catch allegedly was, just give us the U.S. government 15% of the profits.
Wait, the government gets a cut of the sale of advanced tech to China.
That was the reported arrangement, which led critics to conclude, stunningly, that national security has a price tag.
That's breathtaking, if true.
The direct and deeply concerning consequence, critics argue, is that America's most advanced AI chips end up fueling the ambitions of a rival superpower, while the U.S. government, as one source vividly put it, takes a cut like a mob boss.
National security has a price tag. That is a truly unsettling phrase. And this approach, it doesn't just impact NVIDIA or the chip sector, does it? It seems to create a much broader sense of economic instability.
Precisely. The Trump administration's pervasive attempts to sort of control the entire narrative of the economy, by lashing out at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for job numbers they didn't like.
Right, questioning the official data.
By constantly blaming the Federal Reserve for inflation, even while pushing policies that might cause it, by aggressively pressuring the Fed to slash interest rates despite its independence. All of this profoundly contributed to a sense of instability.
Because markets need predictability.
Exactly. As the saying goes, you can't bully the global economy. International investors and markets see this instability. They see the unpredictable use of tariffs, and it leads global capital to potentially flee the U.S. for safer, more stable markets in Europe and Latin America.
And for American consumers back home, what's the impact?
The impact is direct and often painful. Economists estimate that about 70% of tariffs get passed directly on to consumers.
We pay for them.
We pay for them in the form of higher costs for everyday groceries, cars, electronics, building materials, you name it. This combination of rising prices, potentially fueled by tariffs and loose monetary policy, coupled with stagnating wages for many, is a recipe for stagflation.
Stagflation, high inflation plus slow growth. Not a good mix.
A truly challenging economic environment. Ultimately, an economy that seems balanced precariously on NVIDIA's shoulders, tied to the fortunes of one company and subject to this kind of political meddling and transactional foreign policy, it starts to look like a bubble.
A bubble built
not on sustainable, broad-based growth, but on quick fixes, short-term gains, and one very shaky foundation.
The idea that our national security could be blurred by these economic deals and that our entire economy could be perched so precariously, it's a profound warning, isn't it? About the long-term consequences of prioritizing immediate gains, maybe loyalty, maybe deals, over sound, consistent, long-term policy. Okay, next up, let's explore a battle that goes right to the heart of democracy itself. The California redistricting fight.
Redistricting. Always contentious.
Always. But this story is about more than just drawing lines on a map. It's about unprecedented federal interference in state democratic processes and how partisan efforts, fueled by the Trump administration, attempted to undermine the fundamental will of voters in a major state.
This deep dive into California's massive redistricting effort really reveals a concerted and aggressive challenge from the GOP and the administration. It started with California Republicans initiating a new lawsuit specifically to halt the state's voter-approved redistricting plan, which used an independent commission.
Okay, a state-level lawsuit. That happens.
But then, it was significantly bolstered when Donald Trump himself directly announced that his Department of Justice would also sue the state over its redistricting process.
The federal DOJ suing a state over its redistricting maps, that seems like a big escalation.
It's a huge escalation. This federal involvement, crucially, brings immense weight resources, legal authority that can seriously tilt the playing field in court, even if the underlying legal claims, as our sources suggest, might be notably thin. It transformed it from a typical state political squabble into a far more serious federal challenge to state sovereignty and direct democracy.
And the legal arguments themselves, the ones supporting these federal and Republican challenges, you said they seemed thin? Like what?
One of the main arguments pushed by Republicans was based on the single subject rule.
Okay, what's that?
It's a common state constitutional provision designed to prevent log rolling, basically, scuffing a bunch of unrelated ideas into one single ballot initiative, hoping the popular parts carry the unpopular ones.
Right, so they argued the redistricting initiative violated that. How?
They claimed it did, but sources describe the argument as nonsense. Why? Because the initiative was entirely about one subject, redistricting. It covered setting up the independent commission, defining its powers, outlining the map drawing criteria and process. It's all cohesive and directly related to the single topic of redistricting.
So not like combining redistricting with, say, fishing licenses.
Exactly. An initiative might fail the single subject rule if it tried to do something like that. But here, a court would likely see that all the components clearly pertain only to the process and outcome of redistricting. So the argument was seen as weak, a forced fit.
Okay, so that argument was weak. What else could the DOJ have been planning to argue? What were the concerning potential arguments?
Well, this is where it gets interesting and potentially dangerous. The DOJ might have, somewhat paradoxically, tried to invoke the Federal Voting Rights Act, VRA.
Paradoxically, why?
Because many Republicans, including those in the administration, had consistently sought to weaken the VRA over the years. Yet here, they might have argued that California's maps, drawn by the Independent Commission, somehow diluted minority voting power or engaged in racial gerrymandering, triggering VRA scrutiny.
Using a law they often oppose to achieve a partisan goal.
Potentially. But perhaps even more dangerously, they could have pushed the independent state legislature theory, or ISLT.
ISLT, I've heard of that. Remind me what it is.
It's a controversial constitutional theory, sort of resurrected from historical debates, which argues that the U.S. Constitution gives only state legislatures, not state courts, not governors, not independent commissions, and certainly not citizens through ballot initiatives, the authority to set the rules for federal elections, including drawing congressional districts.
Only the legislature? That sounds extreme.
It is. If courts were ever to fully accept this theory, it could have massive implications across the country. It could potentially invalidate all state-level checks on legislative power regarding federal elections, including independent redistricting commissions like California's, state Supreme Court reviews of gerrymandering, and maybe even voter ID laws passed by initiative. It could fundamentally reshape election law.
Wow. Okay, so pushing ISLT seems like a huge gamble for Republicans too, doesn't it? Like playing with fire.
Absolutely. Because arguing too aggressively against ballot initiatives and independent commissions in California could accidentally open the door to striking down all independent commissions nationwide.
Including ones in states where they might actually benefit Republicans.
Precisely. It's a legal argument with potentially unforeseen consequences. And there was also what some called the nuclear option, specifically at play in California.
What was that?
If the Republican and DOJ lawsuits actually succeeded in striking down California's independent commission, well, who gets to draw the maps then?
The state legislature.
Exactly. Yeah. And in California, the Democrats currently control a supermajority, 2/3 of the state legislature.
Oh, so if the commission got struck down,
the highly organized Democrats in the California legislature could step in and draw their own maps, likely far more aggressively gerrymandered in their favor than anything the independent commission would produce. This scenario could potentially cost Republicans 9 or more congressional seats, according to analysts.
So they might have ended up losing more seats than the 5 or so they were trying to save by suing in the first place.
That was precisely the high-stakes gamble, the potential unintended consequence of their legal challenge. It also highlights what critics called a pervasive and rather blatant hypocrisy.
How so?
Well, Republicans routinely engage in aggressive gerrymandering in states they control, like Texas, Alabama, North Carolina, defending it vigorously in court. Yet, they cry foul and invoke federal power when California uses a legal, voter-approved independent process that just happens to produce maps less favorable to them. This selective outrage really undermines any claims of seeking fairness.
So the national implications for democracy here are quite profound then, stretching far beyond California's borders.
Indeed they are. On a purely practical level, even flipping a few congressional seats in a large state like California could easily determine which party controls the U.S. House of Representatives nationally. That affects the entire legislative agenda.
Right. Control of Congress is huge.
But beyond partisan control, this case became a test of whether states can use their own democratic processes, like citizen-led ballot initiatives creating independent commissions, to define their own electoral landscape without federal interference.
And if the DOJ had succeeded?
The success for the DOJ here could have effectively shut the door on direct democracy in other states too, potentially disempowering millions of voters who use initiatives to enact reforms legislatures won't. It becomes part of that much larger overarching fight we keep seeing. Whether we allow democracy to function when it threatens entrenched power, and, critically, whether federal courts will ultimately act to protect voters, or whether they will enable partisan sabotage driven by the political ambitions of an administration, as critics argued was happening here under Trump.
It really drives home that this battle in California wasn't just about lines on a map. It was about the fundamental mechanisms of democracy and whether they can withstand these kinds of federal, politically motivated attacks designed to undermine the will of the people. Okay, let's dive into some of the Trump administration's most, frankly, confusing court battles. Cases that left a lot of people scratching their heads and asking, wait, what just happened?
Yeah, there were definitely a few head scratchers.
We're going to unpack two very different cases now, but they seem to share this common thread. Outcomes that felt illogical and contributed to an erosion of confidence in the straightforward application of the rule of law. First up, the New York civil fraud case against Trump and his business.
The Engoron case.
Right. Here, fraud was pretty unequivocally proven by the judge, but then, in a really strange turn of events, the monumental fine attached to that finding was effectively undone, at least for the time being.
Yeah, this case started with Judge Arthur Engoron's initial and really quite damning ruling. He found that Donald Trump and the Trump Organization engaged in persistent fraud for over a decade.
Persistent fraud? How?
The judgment detailed how Trump inflated his net worth by billions with a B on financial statements given to banks and insurers. He did this through what the court colorfully called a creative accounting style.
Creative accounting, what does that mean in practice?
It included things like wildly exaggerating property values, claiming his apartment was 3 times its actual size, and even, according to testimony, the literal use of whiteout and pencil erasers on financial statements to manipulate figures.
Whiteout and erasers, seriously.
That was part of the testimony and findings. So the original penalty imposed by Judge Engoron was truly substantial. A total judgment of $463 million, including interest. Plus, crucially, the appointment of a court monitor, former federal judge Barbara Jones, to oversee the Trump Organization's financial dealings going forward.
Okay, so a huge fine, ongoing oversight. Seemed like a clear outcome based on the finding of fraud.
That initial ruling certainly seemed unequivocal in establishing the existence and persistence of the fraud and imposing serious consequences.
But then came what our sources called the weird ruling from the appellate division in New York. That seemed to complicate everything.
It really did. You had 5 appellate justices issue 3 separate opinions. So there wasn't even a clear majority consensus on the fraud itself, although a 4-to-1 split in one part suggested that the fraud was at least proven enough to be argued about further at a higher court. It wasn't completely dismissed.
Okay, so the fraud finding wasn't totally overturned, but it wasn't strongly affirmed either.
Kind of left in limbo. But here's the real kicker regarding that massive $463 million fine.
Yeah.
On that point, the appellate justices, or at least a majority needed for this part, deemed the number automatically excessive. They suggested it might even violate the Constitution's 8th Amendment ban on excessive fines.
Automatically excessive, so they just wiped it out.
Effectively, yes. They reduced the financial penalty to 0, pending further appeals or proceedings. However, the court monitor, Judge Barbara Jones, remained in place.
Okay, hold on. So the outcome became fraud, proven, mostly, fine, 0, monitor, still in place.
That's the perplexing state of affairs. Fraud acknowledged, huge penalty erased, but oversight continues. It makes very little intuitive sense.
And naturally, Trump was quick to claim, I won.
Of course. Well, New York Attorney General Letitia James immediately announced she would appeal the fine reduction to the New York Court of Appeals, which is the state's highest court. So the fight over the money isn't over. But that appellate ruling just felt truly detached from the initial finding of massive decade-long fraud.
It really does create this bizarre situation where serious wrongdoing is confirmed, but the immediate substantial financial consequences just evaporate based on a procedural or constitutional interpretation, leaving the penalty phase in complete disarray. Now, simultaneously, we saw a similar kind of legal complexity and, frankly, confusing outcome emerge from the Supreme Court's decision regarding the NIH.
Yes, the National Institutes of Health case.
This concerned the NIH, which is, America's essential engine for medical research. It funds breakthroughs in countless diseases, really vital work.
Absolutely critical for public health. And the Trump administration specifically targeted the NIH. They arbitrarily rewrote crucial funding guidelines for certain types of research grants.
Rewrote the rules mid-game.
Essentially. And then, based on these rewritten rules, they proceeded to cut $850 million worth of ongoing research right in the middle of projects.
$850 million. That's a huge amount of research funding. What kind of research was affected?
These cuts impacted really critical areas. Things like HIV/AIDS research, women's health initiatives, studies focusing on vulnerable communities. It caused immense disruption, potentially setting back vital scientific progress for years. Researchers lost funding overnight for projects already underway.
So researchers and institutions sued, presumably.
They did. The legal challenge focused on whether the administration followed the proper rules, the Administrative Procedures Act, APA, when rewriting those guidelines, and also whether the courts even had jurisdiction to review the funding cuts themselves.
Okay. And the Supreme Court's decision here was, again, described as truly bizarre in its structure.
It was very unusual. We saw not one, but two different 5-4 majority opinions in the exact same case.
Two different majorities. How is that possible?
Because Justice Amy Coney Barrett acted as the pivotal swing vote, joining one coalition of 5 for one part of the ruling and a different coalition of 5 for another part.
Okay, my head hurts already. How did this lead to such a mixed-up, contradictory ruling?
Well, the mixed ruling was, as you suggest, inherently contradictory in its practical effects. In one 5-4 decision, with Barrett joining the liberals and Chief Justice Roberts, the court indeed found that the Trump administration violated the Administrative Procedures Act, APA. Meaning they didn't follow the proper procedures, like notice and comment, when arbitrarily rewriting those NIH funding guidelines. So the court ruled that the rule change itself was illegal.
Okay, so the rule change was illegal. That sounds like a win for the researchers.
You'd think so. But then in a separate 5-4 decision, this time with Barrett joining the other conservatives, the court concluded that the funding cuts that resulted from those illegal guidelines, those cuts could not be reviewed by this particular federal court, the district court where the case started.
Wait, the rule leading to the cuts was illegal, but the cuts themselves can't be challenged here. Where did they have to go?
The court decided that the plaintiffs had to pursue their claims for the lost funding in a different court entirely, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. This is a specialized court focused primarily on monetary claims against the government, not typically on reviewing agency actions for legality under the APA in this way.
So the practical outcome was just incredibly frustrating for everyone affected, wasn't it?
Massively frustrating.
Yeah.
As you summarized it, the guidelines were illegal, but the funding cuts still stand, at least for now, or until they potentially win in a different court years down the line. Scientists still lose their grants. Critical, potentially life-saving research remains stalled or canceled. The illegal action stands, but the immediate remedy is denied.
I remember Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent in this case was particularly pointed. She used a memorable phrase, didn't she?
She did. Justice Jackson, in a powerful dissent, famously called the majority's reasoning Calvin Ball.
Calvin Ball, from the comic strip.
Yeah. Exactly. From Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin Ball is the game where the rules are constantly made up on the fly and make no sense. Justice Jackson argued the court was essentially doing the same here, reverse engineering outcomes to help Trump, as she put it.
Implying the legal reasoning was being manipulated.
Implying it was being manipulated to achieve a desired political result, letting the funding cuts stand despite the illegality of the process, rather than applying legal principles consistently and fairly.
So these two cases, the New York fraud fine vanishing and the NIH funding cut standing despite illegal rules, they're very different on the surface, but they definitely share this disturbing common thread, don't they?
Absolutely. That thread is confusion, complexity, and outcomes that feel deeply detached from common sense. They leave the public, the people watching, with this central, unsettling question.
Which is?
If the system acknowledges wrongdoing but doesn't actually enforce meaningful, timely consequences, then what's the point? That's the core issue that really erodes public trust.
Right, because when the law appears to bend for the powerful, when a former president can be found liable for massive fraud but walk away for now with a $0 fine, or when an administration's illegal actions are confirmed by the highest court, yet the harmful consequences just remain in place.
It fundamentally erodes confidence in the rule of law. And that erosion, it ultimately hits democracy itself. It creates this dangerous perception, fair or not, of a two-tiered justice system where accountability is selective. And that undermines the very institutions meant to uphold fairness and justice for everyone.
This erosion of just basic logic and accountability in such high-stakes cases, it really makes you wonder about the resilience and impartiality of our legal system when it's faced with immense political will and this determined effort to challenge its boundaries. 3. Loyalty, influence, and shifting stances. The blurring of lines. Okay, now let's venture into some really murky waters. We're going to talk about loyalty, influence, and these constantly shifting stances where the lines between political power and, frankly, deeply troubling scandals became dangerously blurred during the Trump administration.
Right, moving into the realm of influence networks and optics.
Exactly. And we have to start with the Epstein-Maxwell-Trump scandal, a story that just refuses to go away, continues to unravel, and seemed to cast a long shadow.
This scandal, far from fading, actually intensified significantly at certain points, particularly when Ghislaine Maxwell testified.
Right, her testimony. What was the objective there from the perspective of those trying to manage the narrative?
Well, at the time, the objective seemed meticulously clear, almost painfully obvious to observers. Scrub away any connection between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. The goal was to definitively distance Trump from the notorious deceased sex offender.
And Maxwell's role in that.
Her carefully choreographed role appeared to be smile, deny, and crucially, drop in the magic phrase, Donald Trump was always a gentleman. Repeat it, reinforce it.
And what made this particular moment feel so revealing, so suspect to critics?
It was the undeniable presence, right there during her deposition or testimony preparations, of Trump's own lawyer, Todd Blanche.
Trump's lawyer was involved in Maxwell's testimony prep.
His presence was noted, leading sources to conclude he was there to orchestrate the script. It made the whole thing feel less like testimony and more like a PR operation dressed up in legal clothes. A transparent attempt at damage control, using Maxwell to clear Trump.
But the reporting suggests it completely didn't work, right? In fact, it might have backfired.
It seemed to backfire spectacularly. Sources suggest it just made the scandal even bigger, precisely because it felt so obviously a setup. The coordination was too visible.
And the reaction?
Even some hardcore Trump supporters were reportedly uneasy and were heard grumbling about it. They found this public display of coordinated denial to be too forced, too transparently manufactured. It raised more questions than it answered.
And the scrutiny didn't stop there. Congress started looking into it.
Exactly. The attempts at damage control only amplified the scrutiny. Key figures in Congress made it clear they weren't letting this drop, with hearings planned, subpoenas considered, and victims potentially being called to testify about the broader network.
So the cover-up attempt just drew more attention. And there was also this sense of a distraction game being played, wasn't there?
Yes, that was another tactic observed by critics. When the Epstein scandal became too hot for the administration, sometimes new, unrelated controversies or crackdowns seemed to erupt, dominating the news cycle.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one instance cited was officials in Chicago suddenly deploying armed federal units to combat what was described as a barely existing violent crime wave. Some observers viewed this as a calculated move, perhaps orchestrated from Washington, to shift public attention away from the Epstein story, make people forget about Epstein by focusing on urban crime fears.
Interesting. And beneath all this public maneuvering, there was this vast, shadowy network of influence connecting various figures, wasn't there? Tell us about Paolo Zempoli.
Paolo Zempoli. He emerges as a key, if sometimes overlooked, figure behind the scenes in Trump's world for decades. He's described as an Italian, man about town, a model agent, sometimes a diplomat.
And his connection to Trump.
He's often credited with bringing Melania Knauss, now Melania Trump, to the U.S. and introducing her to Donald Trump. He also apparently ran a side hustle involving what were called people models, essentially providing beautiful young women from Eastern Europe for high-end parties and events.
Okay. And the Epstein connection.
Jeffrey Epstein was deeply embedded in this same social circle. He reportedly even tried to buy a modeling agency with Zampoli at one point. They moved in the same orbit.
And Zampoli's status now, despite these connections.
Despite his proximity to these controversial figures and activities, Zampoli still reportedly enjoys Trump's blessing. He's been rewarded over the years with titles like Special Envoy to certain organizations and even a prestigious board seat at the Kennedy Center appointed during Trump's term.
Wow. That influence network also extends directly into the legal world, creating what our sources called a striking web of lawyers, right?
Yes, this is another deeply concerning aspect. You see these connections forming a tight circle. For example, Darren Indyke. He was Epstein's longtime personal lawyer and later became the executor of Epstein's vast and mysterious estate.
Okay.
Indyke is now reportedly connected to Trump's orbit professionally through Timothy Parlatore.
Torres.
Parlatore is a lawyer who notably represented Donald Trump himself in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. So Epstein's lawyer connected to Trump's lawyer.
Got it. And Todd Blanche fits in here, too.
Todd Blanche, who we mentioned was involved with Maxwell's testimony prep, is described as Trump's current right-hand legal man. He's handled major cases for Trump, like the Stormy Daniels hush money trial. And remember, he was formerly a federal prosecutor.
Right.
Now, in discussions about a potential future Trump administration, Blanche's name has been floated for the position of Deputy Attorney General of the United States.
Trump's personal lawyer potentially becoming the number 2 at DOJ.
The potential appointment itself massively blurs the line between Trump's personal legal defense and the highest echelons of the nation's justice system.
And there are more connections in this web.
Yes. Blanche's reported buddy, another lawyer named David O. Marcus, is known to be close to Alan Dershowitz.
Who was also one of Epstein's lawyers, famously.
Correct. And Marcus now represents Ghislaine Maxwell. He was present during her key testimony preparations alongside Blanche.
So it really does paint this picture of a cozy club, doesn't it? A cabal of lawyers, as the source put it.
It does. Lawyers moving between prosecution and defense, representing figures in overlapping scandals, seemingly interconnected. Critics argue they appear to defend each other, forming this tight network where loyalties and connections might overshadow other ethical considerations.
This convergence of legal figures, it creates a disturbing perception, doesn't it? A closed system where connections seem paramount. What are the lingering questions from all this? Where could it go?
The lingering questions are profound and far-reaching. The future of the Epstein saga itself could go a lot of ways. Congress could keep pushing, uncovering more. More victims could come forward and testify, potentially implicating others. Or conversely, the cover-up holds. Political allies manage to protect Trump and others from further scrutiny, hoping the story fades.
Has this been compared to other scandals?
An older friend of one of the sources compared this situation, interestingly, to Watergate, but noted a crucial difference. Trump's allies, unlike many of Nixon's eventually, appear to be genuinely terrified of him, which fundamentally changes the dynamic of accountability. People might be less likely to break ranks.
So even if official inquiries get buried, the story isn't really going away, is it?
Probably not entirely. The prediction is the Epstein saga is going to linger. It might become, the next JFK conspiracy, an endless mystery filled with half-truths, rumors, and unanswered questions, precisely because of the lack of transparency and the powerful forces involved.
And the real cost in all this, beyond the politics and the legal maneuvering.
The real, undeniable cost is borne by the real victims whose pain gets overshadowed by all these machinations of power. They deserve truth. They deserve justice. And as the source starkly concludes, regardless of cover-ups, history has a funny way of keeping receipts. Things tend to come out eventually.
It's just a deeply troubling example of how power, absolute loyalty, and this deeply entrenched network of influence can work or attempt to work to obscure truth and accountability, leaving this lingering, corrosive stain on institutions and public trust. All right, finally, let's explore something that often seemed contradictory during the Trump years. Donald Trump's China conundrum.
Ah, yes, the relationship with China. Definitely complex.
This highlights a persistent pattern of shifting stances, transactional deals, policies that frequently seem to undermine his own stated America First principles, and at times, according to critics, even national security itself.
This inherent inconsistency within the Trump administration's China policy was really strikingly evident during one particular press conference. It was a moment that caught many off guard. Donald Trump publicly admired North Korea's dictator, Kim Jong-un.
Which was controversial enough.
Right. And then, almost in the same breath, he proposed that the U.S. should welcome 600,000 Chinese students a year into American universities.
600,000, that number sounds huge. How does it compare historically?
It's staggering. That figure, 600,000, is literally double the historical peak of Chinese students ever recorded in the U.S. in a single year, which was around 300,000 pre-pandemic. and it far, far exceeds the recent total international student enrollment from all countries combined during the COVID-affected years, which dipped to around 370,000.
So a massive, unprecedented influx of Chinese students. How did that square with his usual rhetoric?
It stood in wildly inconsistent contrast to his fiercely articulated America First brand and his usually very hawkish, often critical stance on China regarding trade, espionage, and military rivalry. It led many observers to seriously question the underlying motivations or logic.
Well, there's an economic argument, right? Foreign students are undeniably big business for U.S. universities and the economy.
Oh, absolutely. International students collectively pump an estimated $44 billion into the American economy annually. They support, directly and indirectly, about 400,000 American jobs, professors, staff, local businesses near campuses. So there's a clear, powerful economic incentive to attract them.
So then there's the flip side, the critical national security question.
Yeah.
If you're admitting 600,000 Chinese students annually, how do you vet them? How many are truly here just for education versus those who might be tasked with or feel pressured into reporting back to the Chinese Communist Party?
That's the major concern raised by security agencies and China hawks. China has a well-documented long track record of embedding influence and conducting intelligence gathering within academic and research institutions globally. Vetting students on such a massive scale, 600,000 a year, would be incredibly challenging, perhaps impossible, for agencies like the FBI and State Department.
And even prominent Republicans have raised concerns about this, haven't they?
Yes, even Senator Marco Rubio, known for his very hawkish stance on China, has consistently advocated for limiting Chinese enrollment, particularly in sensitive scientific and technological fields, precisely because of these espionage and intellectual property theft concerns.
And the type of studies matters too, right? What fields do most Chinese students pursue?
That significantly amplifies the concern. The vast bulk of these international students, particularly from China, traditionally come for STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and math.
The very areas driving innovation.
Exactly. The very areas driving future innovation and military power. So the legitimate worry is that the U.S. could be potentially and inadvertently educating the very people who will fuel China's advancements in critical sectors, including those with direct military applications that could eventually be used against U.S. interests.
This sort of transactional view, maybe overlooking security for economic benefit, seems to fit a pattern we saw elsewhere in Trump's China policy, doesn't it?
It does. You see this demonstrated in other instances throughout the Trump administration. Take TikTok, for example.
Right, the app. Big controversy.
Huge controversy. It was once vehemently deemed a major national security threat due to data privacy concerns and potential CCP influence. There were explicit demands for a ban or a forced sale to an American company.
But then Trump's stance seemed to soften.
Strikingly, yes. More recently, Trump seemed not so worried about the app, and the reason cited by critics. Apparently, one of his big donors just happens to be a major TikTok investor.
Ah, money talks.
It reveals, critics argue, a deeply concerning pattern. If there's money on the table or a donor interest involved, the stated national security concerns often seem to fade into the background.
That's a powerful illustration of policy potentially shifting based on personal or donor interests. And we saw something similar with the NVIDIA chips too, right, which we discussed earlier.
Exactly. Trump reportedly greenlit NVIDIA to sell those advanced AI processors to China, despite the profound acknowledged national security implications these chips hold as core building blocks for the future of global military and economic power.
And the rationale seemed to be?
A part of the deal involved securing 15% of the revenue as part of the trade arrangement. It was described as a classic Trump move, always the deal maker, sometimes seemingly prioritizing the deal itself over the strategic implications. These actions, when you sum them up, the student proposal, the TikTok reversal, the NVIDIA deal, they certainly start to look a whole lot like China first, as critics charged, rather than the consistently promised America first.
Did this apparent shift, particularly on the student numbers, cause any backlash from his own base, from the America First crowd?
Oh, yes. This specific policy direction generated significant internal dissent. Even some of Trump's most die-hard supporters, figures like Laura Loomer and Marjorie Taylor Greene, publicly expressed confusion and concern online.
Why? What was their issue?
They argued quite logically from their perspective, that such policies directly contradicted their understanding of an America First stance. They believed America First meant prioritizing American students for university spots and actively working to reduce foreign influence, especially from China, not dramatically increase it.
So it created this dissonance within his own movement.
It really did. And it highlights what seems to be Trump's deeply transactional view of something like education. He largely appeared to see universities primarily as businesses and international students, particularly wealthy ones, simply as customers.
And American students.
He often expressed a preference, or perhaps a vision, where American kids might be better suited for trade schools, while implying that foreign elites take the university seats at top research institutions. It's a very class-based, transactional view of higher education.
And ultimately, that vision.
Ultimately, this vision collides head-on with the America First promise he's been selling since 2016. It exposes this fundamental tension between the populist, nationalist rhetoric and the often pragmatic, transactional, sometimes seemingly contradictory reality of his policies, often dictated by immediate financial or political expediency rather than consistent ideology.
It really does expose that fundamental tension, doesn't it? Between a stated ideology, a core brand, and this often self-serving pursuit of economic or political deals. It leaves us, the listeners, really needing to critically question the true motivations behind these constantly shifting stances.
Outro. Wow. Okay, we have peeled back so many layers today, haven't we?
We really have. It's a lot to process.
Delving into how the Trump administration's actions, its policies from the, almost absurd detail of a thrown sandwich, right up to the vast expanse of global economics.
Exactly. And the very structure of our legal institutions. How all of that consistently challenge the core fabric of American governance and the rule of law.
Yeah, we've seen these recurring themes. How loyalty was repeatedly prioritized over competence, how judicial orders were sometimes openly defied, and how even fundamental principles like national security could become blurred or seem transactional when economic deals were on the table.
It's a compelling and often, frankly, concerning portrait of institutional stress, but also maybe resilience at times.
It is. We saw grand juries standing up to what they saw as governmental overreach. We saw federal judges pushing back, sometimes successfully, against blatant defiance. But we also saw the intricate webs of influence surrounding these high-profile scandals.
Right. So it leaves you with this picture of both profound vulnerability and surprising strength within our system. As you, listening, reflect on these detailed accounts we've walked through, what specific instances really stood out to you? Were there moments that demonstrated the system's inherent resilience? Or moments that highlighted its undeniable fragility under that kind of intense, sustained political pressure?
And maybe thinking longer term, what are these patterns we've discussed? The vindictive prosecutions, the loyalty tests, the defiance of courts, the transactional foreign policy. What do they tell you about the future of accountability in our system and about that delicate, ever-shifting balance of power in American politics?
It really makes you think. When an administration's approach impacts so many diverse aspects of society, from how immigration laws are enforced on the ground, to who gets appointed to the highest federal offices, to the stability of our monetary policy, the integrity of national security, what is the ultimate long-term price we collectively pay for that erosion of established norms, for that direct challenge to our foundational principles?
And maybe the final question for everyone listening is, how do we, as citizens, ensure that our institutions in the end truly serve justice and the common good? How do we ensure they don't just serve the political will of whoever happens to be in power, especially when that will seems determined to bend or even break the rules?
It's a question that definitely lingers long after the headlines fade, doesn't it? And it demands our ongoing attention, our ongoing vigilance.